Hey everybody, what's going on? Helmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. It's Wednesday and the patch is actually live, so let's go ahead and talk through the top 5 changes of patch 13.17. I'll let you guys know what the biggest changes on this week's patch were and what you can be looking forward to in your coming games. 13.17 is a pretty big patch here, as Riot are gearing up for Worlds. This isn't the Worlds patch, but it's pretty close to it. They're addressing fighter and some marksman durability, as well as a couple of other changes made to some other high-profile champions, so let's not waste any more time and hop right into things. First up, I want to make a note about the Blitzcrank changes here. Now, Blitz has always been a very simple yet elegantly designed champion. They're all about the hook, and the rest of their kit is designed to support that, and they've had a very comfortable life as a support entirely for, like, their entire life. That said, Riot muddled the waters a ton when they tried to open Blitz up to jungling. They had to add a bunch of unclear or complicated to their mechanics to their kit in order to make them work, which then they had to nerf Blitz in their preferred role in order to make the jungle stuff work, and generally they just sort of ruined a design that was like perfect by default. And as a result, these changes are just Riot rolling back all of the things that they've done to Blitzcrank over the last year or so to reinforce that they are just back to being the hook support and not really a jungler at all. So if you're a jungle Blitz enthusiast, sorry to say that your build is going away, but I feel like most Blitzcrank players just want them in the support role anyways, and that's exactly where they're going back to, so you can rest assured that Blitzcrank is going to be back to that life. Moving on to the number 4 changes here, we're going to be talking about Hecarim. Now, Hecarim is the first of the fighter champions that Riot are taking a pass at because they're not really being served by the item system. These fighters should feel comfortable building a mix of durability and damage, but instead they're just sort of building all one or all the other because the item system doesn't really help them do what they want to do. In the case of Hecarim, Hecarim is mostly building Muramana into Duskblade of Drakthar right now, and sort of having this really unhealthy spam mana, execute, and then turn invincible kind of build that's just not really any fun to play as, not really any fun to play against, and generally has bound Hecarim to an item that he wasn't really ever intended to be bound to. As a result, Riot are not only lowering his reliance on Manamune by generally changing around his mana stats here. He's gaining a lot more base mana and has less of a mana growth. As a result, if he buys tier, he'll feel less good with it, but if he doesn't buy a tier, he kind of will realize he doesn't really need it. I mean, this is primarily due to the decreasing cost on Rampage. Being down to 20 mana at max rank is a huge discount for Hecarim overall. He just does not need as much mana anymore to spam as much as he is currently. And Riot are also reworking Spear of Shojin on this patch to make it more enticing to fighters in general, but they're specifically calling out Hecarim as one of the fighters that should really synergize with Spear of Shojin. This is the reason behind the W Omnivamp nerf. Generally, they're saying you're going to be queuing so much more in your zone when you have Spear of Shojin on this patch that, like, you don't actually need the additional 5% healing that you're gaining off of this because you're going to be queuing enough to compensate for it overall. Generally, I'm happy with these changes for Hecarim. I think that moving him away from the Tear of the Goddess build will open him up to sort of more traditional fighter and bruiser builds, and I'm very happy and excited to see how these changes shake out. Moving on to number 3 changes here, we're talking about Lux. Now, if you remember the Xerath changes from a couple of patches ago, Riot were making changes because support Xerath was all the rage, and mid lane Xerath wasn't really doing so hot, and they wanted to invert that, to make it so that mid lane Xerath is his preferred role, and support Xerath is like something he can do, but he's not optimal there. Lux is in a very similar boat on this patch. Riot are trying to make it so mid lane Lux is her preferred position, and support Lux is sort of a subset of what she's allowed to do. That said, I think these changes are not nearly as successful as the Xerath changes were. And even Xerath, I guess they proceeded to make additional changes to on this week's patch to make him more about the mid lane, less about support. These changes, I think, have a couple of things that make Lux more enticing in the mid lane. The bonus damage and cooldown reduction on her passive and Q, respectively, with levels specifically, are things that mid lane Lux will be able to access a lot more readily than support Lux. But they're also nerfing down the magic damage that Lucent Singularity does by a fair margin. So I feel like ultimately, mid lane Lux isn't going to feel very different off of these changes. She's going to feel mostly the same. And support Lux will be slightly weaker, but I generally feel like if you want to keep playing support Lux, like, she's still perfectly playable there, and I don't feel like the needle moved very much in terms of preference. Mid lane Lux didn't really change at all in terms of preferability. Support Lux is a little bit weaker, but I feel like she's still playable there, so you're just going to keep playing her at support and not in mid lane. Partially this is due to Lux not having a very easy mechanic that Riot have given her, where that emphasizes mid lane versus another position. Xerath, for example, they gave him the minion execute mechanic, which is something that supports aren't doing, and therefore support Xerath can't access as readily as a mid lane Xerath can, and I feel like Lux needs a mechanic like that. So overall, I think that Lux in general is just sort of meh on these changes. I don't think she's changing altogether too much, so if you're playing in the support position, you're probably feeling basically the same as you were before. The number 2 changes here on this week's patch are the changes to Naafiri. Now, this is her second round of nerfs, actually. She got nerfed on the last patch as well, and she is back in the tank for an additional round of nerfs, specifically due to some of the issues that she's having with being playable top lane, and due to the fact that one of the main ways that she's supposed to have counterplay, she doesn't actually have counterplay for. Right now on live, the way her passive works is she can kind of bank additional pack mates, right? Even if she has 2 pack mates out, we're talking pre-level 9, the cooldown will keep ticking until she has 2 pack mates stored up. So if the pack mates she currently has summoned dies, she'll immediately spawn those 2 pack mates from her sort of storage to replace them instantly. And as a result, I feel like a lot of times you'll kill her pack mates thinking that, like, this is the way I'm supposed to counterplay this champion, only to watch as she replaces them immediately, and then you say, oh, okay, cool, I sunk resources into killing them, and I got no value. And as a result, that sort of place of counterplay that she's intended to have doesn't really exist. The other issue, of course, is that Naafiri has a very powerful sustain option in her Q, and this is most notable in the melee versus melee matchup. It's really hard for melee champions to dodge the Q2, and as a result, Naafiri is just getting a bunch of extra sustain and damage that she isn't really intended to have. The changes Riot are making of this patch, I think, are very good for Naafiri overall by forcing her to be more about the mid lane matchup. Naafiri's dogs now take 100% bonus damage from melee attacks. Again, mostly top laners are going to be benefiting from this, and the cooldown on her pack mates has been significantly increased, so she'll have a lot more time without them in the event that you do manage to actually kill her pack mates. She also has less healing off of Dark and Daggers. The execute damage is mostly staying the same, I believe, which is very good because that way she can still be an assassin, but she's not going to heal for nearly as much in the melee versus melee matchup. So generally, Naafiri is going to feel worse in the melee matchup, and this is mostly going to happen in the top lane, versus in the mid lane matchup where she's going to be feeling generally about the same as she was before. Again, emphasize because she's going to be mostly against ranged champions. I'm a big fan of this general power down for Naafiri. I think that it's a good direction for her to take overall, and I really like that these changes are going live. Finally, for the number 1 change on this week's patch, we're going to be talking about the Vi changes. This is one of the other fighters that has received a bunch of changes to sort of shift the needle on how bursty she's currently building, but in Vi's case, she's in an interesting spot because she either builds full tank or full damage with no in-between, even though she's a bruiser and should be building in between those 2 extremes. As a result, Riot are adding a couple of things to her kit in order to make her more incentivized to build the bruiser build as opposed to going full tank or going full damage. They're mostly doing this by incentivizing W as a second max as opposed to her E second max. This is because the passive cooldown reduction on W is much stronger, and the blast shield strength is also much stronger. That means that a Vi who's able to repeatedly trigger denting blows throughout the course of a fight is going to be getting a lot more sustain than she normally would, and doubly so because the shield strength has been increased further. This means that if you're building tanky, you survive longer in fights, which means you trigger passive more often, which means you survive longer in fights, and it therefore makes you less necessary for her to need to just outright burst someone 100-0 or build full tank because you can't meaningfully do any damage. I think generally this makes it so that a W max second Vi is going to feel much better in these sort of brawling team fights. She'll be a lot more incentivized to do that. Relentless Force also took a cooldown in terms of its overall cooldown, but it also means that it doesn't scale as well with rank, so you kind of don't need to max it second as you would normally. Cease and Desist also lost a ton of damage, but I think that's totally fine. 500 damage at max rank is kind of ridiculous. Also, 110% bonus AD. That ability one-shots you, and I'm happy that it's no longer doing that. Generally, I'm a big fan of the direction of these changes. I think that this not only makes Vi a very interesting pick in terms of her ability to survive in fights and deal lots of damage, but I also think it's going to do a lot to help make Vi rectify the different distinction between tank Vi and damage Vi. Now, it should be bruiser Vi, and that should be the optimal way to play her. Very excited to play around with these changes. But you'll have to let me know which changes you're most excited to play with down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about what you're most excited for on patch 13.17. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days like today as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.